Hey, everybody. Welcome to the 30th episode of the Holy Politician podcast. So many of you have probably heard by now about the email requests that went to federal workers asking them to list 5 things that they accomplished over the past week. Well, that was met with confusion, met with angst across the federal workforce made up of roughly 3 million employees. And that confusion and that angst obviously remains. Most people don't know much about the federal workforce, so let's unpack some facts about the largest employer group in the world. My name is Monica Maybank, and this is the Holy Politician Podcast. On this podcast, we discuss politics, policy, and culture through the lens of truth and holiness. So last Saturday, federal employees seemed shocked to receive an email from HR that in short read this: please reply to this email with approximately 5 bullet points of what you accomplished last week and CC your manager, giving them a deadline of 1 business day to respond. Could you imagine being a federal employee who gets this email on a Saturday, no less, which is supposed to be your day off, giving you 1 business day to respond, not really knowing, is this a prank? Is this something that has to be completed? Is this something that I didn't get cross-checked with my manager or our manager didn't tell us about? And so imagine sitting at your phone or reading your phone or sitting at your desk getting this email. And so, as you might imagine, all hell broke loose on account of this email, as if all hell hadn't already broken loose in the federal government, right? There's a lot going on, and there's been a lot of confusion and a lot of just frustration and instability, particularly as it concerns federal employees. And as an organizational health leadership development professional, this is one of the worst kind of examples of leadership that we've seen in terms of the way that you treat your employees, in terms of the professional care and concern that you give to employees. And so there will continue to be collateral damage taking place right now all over the federal government as it relates to the people that are employed. And so we have to think about the ability to employ empathy for these people, the ability to actually see into their circumstance, as opposed to just listening to what you're reading about and what your chat groups might be talking about how they don't work hard or how they, whatever people are saying. This dynamic is very detrimental and harmful for any human being, particularly if you've been a committed, devoted civil servant working for one of the many federal agencies for years. So we should be praying for all federal workers right now, praying for their state of mind, praying for direction for their own lives, praying for favor, praying that they would truly be obedient, particularly people that are saved, to what God is calling them to do in this season. As you know, something like 700,000 people have resigned from the federal government, taken the buyout. But there are other people that have been laid off outside of that. So we really need to be lifting these people up in prayer. So not only is the federal government a big employer, they're the biggest purchaser of goods and supplies in the world. Nearly $6 trillion is appropriated every year for government spending, right? So, and the federal government is by and large the largest employer. So when President Trump was elected last November, there were just over 3 million federal workers. And although the federal government has grown about 1% every year since 2000, it has kept pace with growth of other industries that have also grown. And so the largest employer in the federal workforce, I wanted to discuss that so that we understand, well, who are these people working for? Well, the largest employer in the federal workforce is the Department of Veterans Affairs. And given that I know 2 veterans in my family, that actually I feel comfortable knowing that they're getting the care that they need. It's the largest employer with 486,000 employees. Most of those employees are in healthcare with the VA, right? There's VA hospitals all over the country and even around the world. And many of them are health practitioners that are in service to our vets. That's a department we should care about, is a department that should run more efficiently, yes. And changes have been made throughout administrations, really good changes, positive changes. There are lots of changes that can still be made. The smallest employer is the Department of Education with 4,245 employees. And so the US Department of Education is one of the departments, as many of us have heard, that Republicans have tried to eliminate since Ronald Reagan was president, right? And this is in the 80s. And so there are talks in earnest right now of still getting rid of this department through the current administration. Now, administration is not included as a right in our United States Constitution. However, former elected officials and politicians like former President Jimmy Carter thought it was important enough for there to be a department or an agency that managed some of the specific education laws that came out of Congress. President Reagan felt that it was an issue that should be left with the states. Here he is in his own words.
Pardon me, but you've just reminded me of another facet of my program. Calls for a re-implementation of the 10th Article of the Bill of Rights. That is the one that says the federal government shall do only those things that the Constitution calls for, and all others shall remain with the states or the people. I propose, and would have already started, a planned and orderly transfer back to the states and local communities of functions the federal government has usurped and which it has proven it is incapable of operating. And one of the first of those would be welfare. One of the second would be in the field of education. I would like to dissolve the $10 billion National Department of Education created by President Carter and turn schools back to the local school districts where we built the greatest public school system the world has ever seen. I think I can make a case that the decline in the quality of public education began when federal aid became federal interference.
And this really tends to be the sentiment of many Republicans. And I am not a fan of doing things over and over again that don't work, right? Because that is the definition of insanity, continuing doing the same thing and expecting a different result. And so if we've been continuing with the same type of policies, the same type of kind of resources and strategies and provisions in education law that really don't seem to be working for kids, particularly at the federal level, like these high stakes annual assessments well, they're really not high stakes for kids at the federal level, but these annual assessments that every kid has to take to gauge their performance or to gauge a school district or a state or a school's performance. Like if we keep doing the same thing every year, but the education outcomes really aren't changing by much, particularly for Black students, Latino students, and other underrepresented groups, then why would we continue to do the same thing? Why would we rely on the federal government for certain guardrails or certain language around what should be happening in schools if really education has not gotten any better? And for the most part, education has not increased significantly over a few decades. And so now, just because the Department of Education might eventually fizzle out, it doesn't mean that existing laws go away, right? There will still be a Title IX that governs protections that are based and avoid sex-based discrimination. There will still be an Elementary and Secondary Education Act as long as it gets reauthorized. There will still be a Higher Education Act. There will still be funding for grants at the local and at the state level and for college students, right? At least for now or for the next few years, or maybe administrations. The reality is, if you get rid of a department, it doesn't necessarily mean that the funding goes away or the programs go away, because a lot of those are codified in statute. It just means that some other department or agency may take that on. And it means that you're reducing the amount of money that you're spending, hiring staff, paying benefits, all of those things to make our government more efficient and for us to get out of the $36 trillion of debt that we're in. That's a small portion. Again, the Department of Education is a very small agency. Now, the reality is most states only rely on about 5 to 10% of their education budget from the federal budget. And so it's a small portion. For some states, that portion makes a big deal. But how can states start really be thinking right now, well, how can they reallocate their budget to kind of accommodate that 5 to 10% that they rely on for the federal government, so that the states again can start making decisions on education themselves. So that's just one part of what's been happening with the federal government employees, with threats of losing their jobs, and how this might affect the policies that affect your children, my children, our children's children. But of all of the things that have been alarming over the past several weeks, most recently concerning the federal workforce, I've seen blatant racist language used, particularly in social media, concerning who is employed with the federal government. One particular tweet that caught my eye, that has been retweeted and commented on by hundreds, if not thousands of people, read this: "Turns out that we're paying reparations this entire time in the form of useless government jobs that our tax dollars paid for." This was in response to false claims that 65% of all Black women with university degrees work for the federal government. Even if 65% of Black educated women worked for the federal government, so what? Who cares? How is earning a job and earning a good living reparations when that's something that you earned and didn't automatically get just because you were of a certain racial persuasion? So to insinuate that the American economy is paying reparations because Black people have a job that they're actually working to earn is pretty, it's detrimental, it's dangerous. And this is the kind of language, the kind of vernacular, the kind of vitriol, the kind of thing that really continues to perpetuate this racial animus in our country. The fact that somebody could even form their fingers to type out something like that is horrible, and it's dangerous, right? There's already this dangerous language around people who are DEI hires or affirmative action hires. I just think we need to do a better job empathizing with people. But I also recognize that not everybody on social media is saved, right? But you don't have to be saved to be a good person, to be somebody who has dignity and integrity and compassion for people. According to recent data, 18.6% of all federal workers are Black. So that is the percentage of all federal workers who are Black, which is a higher share than the civilian workforce. So there are more Black people that are working for the federal government than in the overall workforce. There's a recent news report that basically is titled, "Much of the Black Middle Class Was Built by Federal Jobs." This article goes on to describe that because many Blacks are being overlooked in the private sector due to racial bias in hiring and promotions, the federal government had a razor focus on equal employment opportunity. Because of that, it provided reliable jobs and benefits for Black people. I don't see how that's a bad thing. And so earning a job is not the same as reparations, right? But if you want to distribute reparations to our people, you're more than welcome, considering that much of this nation's economic engine and power and generational wealth was stimulated by free Black slave labor. Like, that's not something that ever escapes my mind or my imagination. So for somebody to say that Black people earning a job and working hard to earn a wage are earning reparations really is an affront to Black people who work hard to earn a wage and to save up and to earn a retirement for themselves and their children. In this season, we have to educate ourselves. We can't believe everything we read, everything we hear. We really have to protect our hearts and guard our hearts. We have to protect our minds, our ear gate and our eye gate, and really do your research. Loose lips is something for fools. And as long as you are studying the text, reading and doing your own research, you won't have loose lips. I would encourage you to tune in to the President's joint address to Congress. It's next Tuesday, March the 4th at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. Who knows what he'll say? However, it keeps you educated on what's taking place. It gives you a bird's eye view into the mind and the thoughts of this current administration. Continue to pray for our president, pray for his cabinet, pray for all of us that are impacted by these policies, and more important than anything else, prepare your family for things that you are dealing with on a day-to-day basis. And so I pray that you learned something new from this podcast. I'd encourage you to subscribe if you haven't already and share this podcast with 5 people that you know. Thanks for joining.